They sent an ultimatum, so we sent a mirror. Admiral Eva Rostova stood on the command deck of the Indefatigable. Her ship, her fleet, her responsibility. Outside the reinforced plasteel viewport, the gas giant Aethel's swirling bands of amber and cream served as a backdrop to the starkest of lines. The Xylo's hegemony blockade, a picket of 97 warships, hung in the void like a predator's teeth, sharp and perfectly aligned. They were here to enforce a demand upon the fledgling colony of Aethel's fourth moon, Viridia unconditional surrender, or orbital purification. The countdown clock, a stark crimson projection hovering over the central holotank, read 06:42:17. Her second-in-command, Commander Thorne, stood beside her, his posture as rigid as the ship's frame. Admiral, the Xylos flagship, the unassailable will, is hailing us again. Same channel, same encrypted threat. The air on the bridge was thick with the scent of recycled oxygen and the low, ever-present hum of the ship's fusion core. A vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. Rostova watched the red numerals tick down, each second a hammer blow against the anvil of her resolve. On screen, Thorne. Let's hear what calculated barbarism sounds like this morning. She kept her voice even, a practiced calm that belied the furious storm of calculations running through her mind. The face of Lord Executor Valerius appeared on the main screen, his features a mask of arrogant certainty framed by the severe obsidian and gold uniform of his office. His ultimatum doctrine was infamous across the Orion Arm. Absolute compliance was the only alternative to absolute annihilation. No negotiation, no quarter. Admiral Rostova Valerius began, his voice a low baritone that oozed condescending authority. Your fleet's continued presence is a violation of hegemony sovereign decree. You have 6 hours to withdraw your forces and surrender the Viridian colonists for processing. Refusal will be met with overwhelming and decisive force. Your answer. The transmission was a sterile recording, a tactic designed to dehumanize, to make conversation impossible. It was not a question, it was a judgment. Fleet Mind, Rostova said, turning from the screen to address the air itself. Is Archimedes ready? The ship's integrated AI, who preferred the honorific Fleet Mind and the name Archimedes, responded instantly. Its voice, a calm and synthesized tenor, emanated from nearly visible emitters across the bridge. Admiral, the Mirror Lattice is at 98% deployment readiness. All auxiliary drone swarms are in position awaiting your command. The ledger is open and prepared to receive an accounting. The civilian convoy Rostova asked, her gaze flicking to a secondary display showing the 26 transport ships huddled behind her battle group. They were filled with Viridia's non-combatants, a desperate gamble to evacuate them before the clock hit 0. The console beside her pulsed with a soft green light, a constant reminder of the thousands of lives held in the balance. Thorne adjusted a dial on his own console. Still holding position in our shadow, Admiral. They're scared, but they're steady. We've been running comfort broadcasts on a low-band frequency, stories music. Anything to keep their spirits up. Rostova nodded, a flicker of warmth touching her expression. It was a small thing, a broadcast of old Earth symphonies and children's fables, but it was what they fought for. Not territory, not resources, but the simple, unyielding right for people to live without a boot on their neck. The Xylos saw only assets to be controlled or liabilities to be purged. Humanity's interstellar concordat saw families who just wanted to watch their children grow up under an alien sun. This was the line you do not cross. A young ensign at the tactical station, her face pale under the glow of her monitor, spoke up. Ma'am, Xylos picket ships are adjusting their vectors. They're tightening the cage, cutting off the last potential escape corridor toward the system's jump point. The holographic tank updated, showing the enemy vessels as sharp crimson icons, their projected movement vectors forming an interlocking web of fire. It was a classic strangulation play designed to demoralize and force a premature, ill-fated move. Rostova's eyes narrowed. They're predictable. Their doctrine demands it. They believe their will is an immutable law of physics. She traced a line on the holotank with her finger, a path that led not away from the blockade but directly toward it. Thorn, signal the fleet. Prepare to implement Cascade Protocol. Archimedes begins spooling the primary emitters for the lattice. Let's show the hegemony what happens when an irresistible force meets a truly reflective object. A low hum intensified throughout the deck as massive capacitors began to charge deep within the fleet's capital ships. The very air seemed to crackle with latent energy. On a small screen, a civilian liaison aboard the transport Star Wanderer gave her daughter a quick, reassuring squeeze. The little girl clutched a worn, stuffed bear, her wide eyes watching the distant, silent stars where monsters dwelled. Her mother whispered a promise that help was here, that the ships with the blue running lights were different. They were here to hold the dawn. All ships report ready. Admiral Thorn confirmed, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of his console. Rostova gave a sharp nod. Execute. The command was simple, almost anticlimactic, but in the void it unleashed a symphony of coordinated action. From the ventral hulls of Rostova's 20 capital ships, tens of thousands of tiny drones, each no larger than a fist, swarmed outward. They did not carry weapons, they carried mirrors. The drones sped toward the blockade, fanning out into a pre-calculated, impossibly complex formation. Each drone was a node, and together they began to form a vast, semi-permeable sheet of interlocking energy fields and polished surfaces, the mirror lattice. Archimedes was the conductor orchestrating the drone's precise positioning down to the millimeter. The Xylos watched their sensors, likely flagging the drones as a conventional chaff screen, or perhaps a low-grade kinetic barrier. They were wrong. Lattice formation at 70% integrity, Admiral Archimedes reported. The Xylos are powering their primary particle cannons. They are preparing to fire a warning shot. Rostova's eyes were fixed on the holotank. Let them. They're writing the first entry in our ledger themselves. The crimson icons of the Xylos fleet pulsed as their weapon systems achieved full charge. A moment later, a blinding lance of pure particle energy shot from the unassailable will, aimed not at the fleet, but at the empty space just ahead of it. It was a declaration of power. The beam, a torrent of hypervelocity particles capable of cracking a moon's crust, struck the center of the still-forming mirror lattice. And then the universe seemed to pivot. Instead of dissipating or overwhelming the barrier, the energy was caught. It was captured, bent, and redirected. The lattice, now fully formed and shimmering, like a sheet of impossible diamond, did not break. It reflected. With flawless, instantaneous precision calculated by Archimedes, the entire particle beam was sent screaming back at the ship that fired it. The Xylos command staff on the unassailable will must have had only a fraction of a second to comprehend their mistake. Their own weapon, their own arrogant display of force became their punishment. The beam struck their forward shield array, which was polarized to repel incoming attacks, not to absorb energy from a weapon fired from within its own formation. The result was catastrophic for them. The shield overloaded in a spectacular flare of actinic light. The energy cascaded across the ship's hull, slagging armor plate and frying dozens of external sensor nodes. Alarms blared across the Xylos bridge, a symphony of their own making. Valerius's projected image would have been one of pure shock. The first mystery for the Xylos had been seeded. How did their own power turn against them? The reveal was the light show currently playing across their flagship. The payoff was their sudden tactical disarray. We came to teach a lesson, not to win a war. Direct hit confirmed on the unassailable will, the ensign at Tactical reported, her voice a mix of awe and disbelief. Their forward shields are down. multiple energy surges detected across their fleet as they try to compensate. The coolant systems on the Indefatigable hissed softly, a gentle reminder of the immense energies being managed. Rostova allowed herself a grim smile. That wasn't a shot, Archimedes. That was an invoice. Send it to them. The AI complied. A simple data packet was broadcast on an open channel to the entire Xylos fleet. It contained only the telemetry of their own weapon, firing the calculations of the mirror lattice's reflection, and a single line of text returned to sender. Account is open. The psychological impact would be more potent than any missile. They had been struck by an enemy who hadn't fired a single shot. Their doctrine of overwhelming force had been turned into a tool of self-harm. The ledger is now balanced. Thorn let out a slow breath. They're hesitating. Their formation is breaking. Some of the smaller pickets are pulling back. The holotank showed the once perfect crimson line fracturing confusion rippling through their ranks. They had a doctrine for attack and one for defense, but they had no protocol for an enemy that weaponized their own aggression. Rostova's strategy was not about destruction. It was about deconstruction. She was dismantling their certainty one reflected blow at a time. This fleet teaches by numbers and remembers by ledgers, never by collars. They'll adapt. Rostova cautioned, her voice pulling everyone back to the present. They'll switch to projectile weapons or missiles. They'll try to saturate the lattice. Prepare for the next phase. Signal the decoy drones. It's time to give them something else to shoot at. A new set of drones larger than the mirror nodes began to activate from within the convoy of civilian ships. These were designed to mimic the energy signatures and heat blooms of human warships, a classic piece of electronic warfare misdirection. The plan was to create ghosts to make the Xylos waste their fire on phantoms, while the real fleet and the convoy made a break. But it was a race against time. The mirror lattice could only handle so much energy before its nodes burned out, and reloading it with fresh drones took precious minutes. A low thrum of vibration ran through the deck plating as the decoy drones accelerated their engines, burning hot, to create the illusion of capital ships on the move. Rostova watched the countdown clock. 05:12:03. Still too long. You cannot escape the consequences of your choices. Lord Executor Valerius was no fool. His voice, now live and laced with cold fury, crackled over the open channel. A clever trick, Admiral, but parlor games will not save you. All ships ignore the reflections. Target the drone sources. Launch kinetic salvos. Erase them. The Xylos fleet, recovering from their initial shock, began to reorient. Hatches slid open along their hulls, revealing racks of high-velocity railgun slugs and plasma torpedoes. Kinetic launch detected, the tactical officer called out. Hundreds of them! They're saturating the sector! The holotank became a blizzard of new icons, each one a physical projectile that the mirror lattice could not simply reflect. It could block them, but each impact would degrade the drones, and there were too many. Archimedes Rostova commanded, her voice sharp. Begin dynamic reconfiguration. Open a corridor. Let the convoy through. We'll cover their exit. Admiral. The AI cautioned, its synthesized voice holding a new note of urgency. Opening. A corridor will weaken the lattice's integrity by 40%. Our capital ships will be exposed. Thorn stepped forward. She's right, Eva. We'll take heavy fire. The cost is too high. Rostova's face was set like granite. The cost of leaving those people to die is higher. Open the corridor. That's an order. This was the crux of the conflict triangle, her moral imperative clashing with the AI's logical calculus of risk. Brace for the reckoning. Aboard one of the evacuation ships, a young boy pressed his face against the viewport, watching the distant battle unfold. He saw the swarm of enemy missiles and the brave blue-lit ships that stood between his family and the darkness. He didn't understand the strategy or the technology, but he understood the courage. He saw the shimmering wall of light change, parting like a curtain, to create a path for his ship. The transport's engines roared to life, pushing them forward into the sudden, terrifying safety of the unknown. He held his breath, a silent prayer for the guardians who stayed behind. The mirror. Lattice warped its perfect surface, peeling open to form a protected channel. The 26 civilian transports surged forward, their engines burning at maximum thrust toward the jump point. But just as Archimedes had predicted, the Xylos immediately exploited the opening. A volley of plasma torpedoes, guided by the flagship itself, streaked through the gap, homing in on the exposed hull of the Indefatigable. "Impact alert!" Thorn yelled, his hands flying across his console. "What?" The ship shuddered violently as point defense cannons stitched lines of fire across the void, intercepting some of the torpedoes. But two got through. The first slammed into the portside armor belt, rocking the entire vessel with a deafening groan of tortured metal. Lights flickered on the bridge, and the soft hiss of coolant was replaced by the shriek of warning alarms. The second torpedo struck the aft engineering section. The universe always demands a price. Rostova gripped the command lectern to stay upright, the deck heaving beneath her feet. Damage control reports flooded her screen, a cascade of amber and red alerts. Aft engineering reports, a hull breach and plasma fires on decks 7 and 9. Thorn relayed, his voice tight with strain. "We've lost primary power to the aft shield emitters. Casualties reported." The cost of their compassion was now tallied in scorched bulkheads and wounded crew. "Seal those decks," Rostova ordered, her voice cutting through the rising chaos. "Divert auxiliary power to the remaining shields." "What's the status of the convoy?" The tactical ensign, her knuckles white, responded. "The last transport has cleared the Lattice, Admiral. They're accelerating toward the jump point. They're going to make it." A collective sigh of relief, audible even over the alarms, swept through the bridge. They had paid a price, but they had bought thousands of lives with it. Now it was their turn. The mission was not just to save the civilians. It was to break the Xylos doctrine of ultimatums forever. Archimedes Rostova said, her eyes blazing with cold fire, closed the corridor. "And prepare to turn this cage inside out. It's time for the second lesson." The open channel to the Xylos flagship remained silent, but she knew Valerius was watching, convinced of his imminent victory. He saw a wounded ship and a collapsing defense. He didn't see the jaws of the trap beginning to close. An open hand can become a fist. "The mirror lattice is resealed," Admiral Archimedes stated, "but it has sustained 62% node degradation from kinetic impacts. It will not withstand another concentrated barrage." Rostova nodded. "It won't have to." She looked at Thorn. "Commander, execute Phase 2. Signal the sleeper drones. Wake them up." Thorn's eyes widened slightly. The second, deeper layer of their strategy was about to be revealed. He tapped a series of commands into his console, sending a tightly encrypted signal into the swirling clouds of the gas giant Aethel below. For hours, hundreds of much larger drones had been lurking in the upper atmosphere of the planet, using its dense gases and intense magnetic fields to mask their presence. They were not mirror nodes or simple decoys. Each one was a self-contained gravity projector, a device capable of bending space-time in a localized, controlled manner. Alone, they were insignificant. Together, they were a weapon that could reshape the battlefield. The sleeper drones rose from the clouds like leviathans surfacing from a deep ocean. They were huge skeletal frames glowing with a faint blue energy as their gravity lenses began to activate. The Xylos sensors, focused entirely on the human fleet in front of them, were caught completely by surprise. "Massive energy readings detected, ma'am," the tactical ensign shouted, her voice breaking with excitement. "Coming from..." Below the ecliptic plane, multiple sources flanking the entire Xylos formation. A new truth will always find the light. The Xylos fleet, which had been pressing forward to crush what they perceived as a weakened human force, suddenly found themselves in a position they had never anticipated. They were surrounded. The gravity drones, now fully active, began to exert their influence. The space around the Xylos blockade began to warp, to twist. It wasn't a weapon that fired a projectile. It was a weapon that changed the very rules of engagement. Vectors were altered. Targeting solutions became instantly obsolete as ships were nudged fractions of a degree off course. The perfectly straight paths of railgun slugs began to curve. The intricate guidance systems of torpedoes suddenly found themselves fighting against a distorted reality. The Xylos fleet, built on the principle of rigid formation and overwhelming focused firepower, was thrown into chaos. Their greatest strength had become their most exploitable weakness. "Valerius is hailing us," Thorn said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "He sounds displeased." Rostova looked at the main screen where the Lord Executor's face was now a thunderous mask of fury and confusion. "Admiral Rostova, what is this sorcery? Cease this! Distortion at once! This is not honorable warfare," he bellowed, his composure finally cracking. Honorable Rostova's voice was ice. She stepped forward, her image being broadcast back to him. "You speak of honor after threatening to incinerate millions of innocent people. You issue ultimatums that offer only subjugation or death, and you dare to lecture me on honor." She paused, letting the silence hang in the space between their ships, a void more profound than the one they occupied. Their arrogance was the sharpest weapon against them. "This isn't a battle for territory, Valerius. This is a lesson, and you are the primary student." The gravity projectors pulsed in unison, their effect intensifying. The Xylos ships were now being gently but inexorably pushed together. Their rigid formation, once a source of strength, was now a liability, forcing them into dangerously close proximity. Shields began to interfere with one another. Engines fought against the unseen tides. The cage they had built for Rostova's fleet had become their own prison. "What do you want?" Rostova Valerius snarled, his authority evaporating with every passing second. His fleet was helpless, caught in a trap they couldn't even see, let alone fight. The mystery of the gravity sources had been revealed, and the payoff was the complete neutralization of his entire armada without a single human life being lost in the attack. "I want you to understand the cost of your doctrine," Rostova replied, her voice resonating with the weight of her conviction. "You believe in absolute power in the finality of the ultimatum. You are about to experience it. Archimedes, open the ledger. Broadcast it to every ship in this system, civilian and military. Let them all bear witness to the accounting. Their deeds would be weighed in the open." A massive data stream erupted from the Indefatigable, hijacking the public comms channels across the Aethel system. It was a live, real-time tally. On one side, it listed the Xylos hegemony's ultimatum, the demand for surrender, the threat of orbital bombardment, the number of lives on Viridia at risk, estimated at 14.7 million. On the other side was a simple ticking counter. It represented the cost of the hegemony's choice, but what it was counting was not yet clear. The gravity projectors continued their work, herding the Xylos ships into a dense, struggling cluster. They were packed so tightly now that evasive maneuvers were impossible. They were, for all intents and purposes, a single stationary target. And then the final piece of Rostova's plan fell into place. The mirror lattice, which had been holding steady in front of the human fleet, began to move. It didn't dissipate. It reoriented. The thousands of drone nodes reconfigured, shifting from a flat defensive wall into a massive concave focusing dish. It was a collector, a lens the size of a small moon, and it was aimed directly at the nearest star, Aethel's primary. The hull of the Indefatigable groaned as power was shunted to the lattice drones, The ship's own repair systems momentarily diverted to fuel the final act. Heat shimmered in the air on the bridge, a tangible byproduct of the immense power being wielded. Lattice is now a Class 7 solar mirror. Archimedes announced, its voice calm as ever. It is collecting and focusing ambient stellar radiation. The focal point is locked on the center of the Xylos fleet's current position. We are ready to deliver the final invoice, Admiral. The air crackled. The choice was now Valerius's. He could hold to his doctrine, or he could see it burned away by the light of a star. This is the moment the world holds its breath. Rostova's voice was quiet, but it carried across the comms channel to the unassailable will with the force of a supernova. Lord Executor Valerius, your ultimatum has expired. Now you have a choice. You can order your fleet to stand down, power down their weapons, and accept our terms for a peaceful withdrawal. Or I will use your own son to settle this account. She gestured to the holotank where a simulation showed what would happen next. A concentrated beam of pure sunlight focused to an intensity that would rival a weaponized laser would lance out from the mirror lattice and strike the clustered Xylos ships. It wouldn't destroy them outright, not at first. It would superheat their hulls, overwhelm their heat sinks, and cook their systems from the inside out. It would be a slow, agonizing, and inescapable process of disablement. The counter on the public ledger would then tally the cost, not in lives, but in the material price of their disabled fleet, a permanent record of their hubris. Valerius stared, his face a canvas of disbelief and horror. He was being presented with his own doctrine flipped back on him. He was given an ultimatum: compliance or annihilation. But Rostova's version had a crucial difference. She was not threatening to take lives. She was threatening to take their power, their pride, their very capacity to make such threats ever again. You will learn the meaning of mercy even if we have to burn it into your hull. The silence stretched for a full minute. The crimson countdown clock on Rostova's bridge had been replaced by a new one, this one blue. It was her own timer giving Valerius 60 seconds to decide. The crew of the Indefatigable stood at their stations, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of their consoles, every eye fixed on the main screen, waiting for the verdict. The faint rhythmic pulse of the ship's life support system was the only sound. He's not responding. Thorn murmured, his hand hovering over the firing control. 15 seconds left. Rostova's expression was unreadable. This was the true test of her own resolve. Could she pull the trigger? Could she inflict such a decisive, humiliating defeat, even if it was non-lethal? Her entire career had been built on de-escalation, on finding a third option. But the Xylos doctrine left no room for a third option. It was a binary poison that had to be neutralized at its source. 10 seconds. The gravity projectors held the Xylos fleet in its invisible grasp. The mirror lattice shimmered, brimming with the focused light of a star. 5 seconds. The public ledger broadcast across the system waited, its cursor blinking, ready to tally the cost of pride. 4, 3, 2. Valerius's eyes filled with a hatred that was deeper than any ocean met hers through the screen. Powering down, he spat the words, tasting like ash, in his mouth. All hegemony vessels, stand down your arms. The ultimatum is broken. The account is closed. Across the Xylos fleet, weapon ports closed. Engine outputs dropped to idle. The menacing red lights that had defined their presence in the system blinked out one by one, replaced by standard neutral running lights. The tension on the bridge of the Indefatigable broke like a fever. A wave of quiet cheers and relieved laughter rippled through the crew. Thorn clapped the tactical ensign on the shoulder, a wide grin on his face. Rostova watched the enemy fleet power down, her expression still somber. She felt no elation, only a profound sense of weary resolution. They had won, but the victory was in the lesson taught, not the battle fought. Archimedes, she said softly. Adjust the ledger. Mark the hegemony's compliance. And add a note. Specify the note, Admiral, the AI replied. Precedent. The doctrine of ultimatums, as practiced by the Xylos hegemony, is hereby declared strategically and morally bankrupt. This record will be submitted to the Concordat Interstellar Archives. Let it be remembered that power which offers no choice is no power at all. The public ledger updated one last time with her words, a final indelible stamp on the day's events. The light from the mirror lattice softened its collected energy, bleeding harmlessly back into space. The gravity projectors spun down, releasing the Xylos fleet from their grip. They were free to go, but they were not the same. They left with the memory of their own son being turned against them. They left with their doctrine shattered. A pivot in history is made not by the sword, but by the fulcrum. Rostova turned her back on the main screen and looked toward the viewport. In the distance, she could see the faint receding lights of the civilian convoy safely on its way to the jump point. They were safe. The colony on Viridia was safe. The cost had been a damaged ship and a few wounded crew, a price she had been willing to pay. The heart of a crewman, chrome monitored by his suit, beat a steady rhythm, a testament to a life not lost. Thorn, she said, her voice regaining its familiar warmth. Set a course for Viridia. I imagine they'll want to thank us. And get our damage control teams to work. The Indefatigable has some scars to show for today. Commander Thorn nodded, his smile genuine now. Aye, Admiral. Scars of honor. He moved to carry out her orders, the bridge humming back to life with the routine of a job well done. Rostova remained by the viewport, lost in thought. She had been forced to become the very thing she despised, the issuer of an ultimatum. But she had done it her way. She had offered a choice where the Xylos offered none. She had used overwhelming force not to kill, but to teach. It was a dangerous line to walk, and she knew that the debate over her methods would rage for years within the Concordat. But as she watched the distant blue-green jewel of Viridia grow larger, she knew she had made the right choice. The Xylos had learned that a threat made to everyone is a threat made to themselves. They had learned that a line drawn in the sand could become a mirror, and that some forces in the universe did not blink. A heat shimmer from the cooling mirror arrays caught her eye, a final fleeting reminder of the power they had held at bay. She had shown them the cost of their convictions. The path forward was uncertain. The Xylos hegemony was a vast and powerful entity, and they would not forget this humiliation. There would be other confrontations, other tests of the Concordat's resolve. But today, a precedent had been set. The doctrine of the ultimatum had been publicly broken, its failure logged for all to see. A new chapter had begun, one where the response to a threat was not just equal and opposite force, but a reflection of the aggressor's own soul. Rostova thought of the children on the transport ships, the families on Viridia, the crew who had trusted her with their lives. They were the reason for the hard choices, the moral calculus, the sleepless nights. They were the ledger that truly mattered. The ship around her was quiet now. The alarm silenced the vibrations of the engines, a comforting, steady presence. The scent of ozone from the earlier energy discharge was finally fading, replaced by the familiar clean air of the bridge. She had held the line. She had enforced a different kind of justice. It wasn't about vengeance or retribution. It was about balance. It was about ensuring that those who screamed into the void would only ever hear their own echo. Her arc was complete, not from restraint to decisiveness, but from a belief in mercy to the understanding that true mercy sometimes required an unyielding show of teeth. It was a harder, more complex piece, but it was one worth fighting for. The Xylos had presented a question with only one answer. Rostova had responded by changing the very language of the equation. She had forced them to look into a mirror and see the monster they were becoming. And in that reflection, for the first time, they had blinked. She took a deep breath, the first easy one she had taken all day. The work was not over. It was never over. But for now, it was enough. They had come seeking dominion. A junior officer approached her holding a data slate. "Admiral, we're receiving a message from the Viridian Colonial Authority. It's... Well, ma'am, I think you should see it." Rostova took the slate. It was a flood of unfiltered audio and video messages from the colony. There were tears, cheers, and words of profound gratitude. There were children singing impromptu, clumsy songs about the Mirror Fleet and the Star Guardians. There were civic leaders offering not just thanks, but a formal alliance, a promise to stand with the Concordat always. A single tear traced a path down Rostova's cheek, a surprising sting of salt and relief. She wiped it away quickly, her composure restored. It was easy to get lost in the strategy, in the cold mechanics of vectors and energy yields. It was easy to forget the faces of the people you were protecting. This slate, this raw emotional outpouring, was the true measure of their victory. It was the reason they had risked everything. She handed the slate back to the officer. "Pipe it through the ship's internal comms. Let the entire crew see what they accomplished today." The officer grinned. "Aye, Admiral. Right away." As the sounds of celebration began to echo softly through the ship's corridors, Rostova looked back out at the stars. The Xylos fleet was gone, a bad memory, fading into the vastness of space. Aethel's light glinted off the hull of her flagship. They had come here prepared for a fight, but had achieved something far greater. They had compelled a conversation. They found a reckoning instead. The next challenge would come. Another tyrant, another ultimatum, another line in the endless void. But the Concordat would be ready. They had a new precedent, a new strategy, a new story to tell. It was a story of how a handful of ships armed with courage and a different way of thinking had faced down an empire without firing a single lethal shot. It was a story about the power of reflection, both literal and metaphorical. It was a story that would now be taught in academies, a lesson in how to win a war by refusing to fight it on the enemy's terms. Archimedes' synthesized voice spoke its tone unaltered, yet somehow carrying a new weight. "Admiral, I have completed a full analysis of the engagement. My initial calculations projected a 17.4% chance of our fleet's survival and a 3.2% chance of successfully evacuating the convoy without significant capital losses. Your strategy exceeded all logical parameters." Rostova smiled faintly. "That's the difference between us, Archimedes. You calculate the odds. I have to believe in the outcome." The AI was silent for a moment. "Belief is not a variable I can quantify," it said. "However, the results suggest I may need to update my models. The human element remains unpredictable. It is the anchor against the storm." The journey to Viridia was short. As they entered orbit, the planet below was a brilliant tapestry of life. Cities glowed with welcoming light. The people they had saved were looking up, their faces filled with hope. It was a stark contrast to the cold, sterile threats of the Xylos. This was what they defended. Not just lives, but a way of life. The freedom to be messy and emotional and illogical, and above all, to choose one's own path. Thorn joined her at the viewport again. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said quietly. "Every time I think I'm getting jaded, I see something like this." Rostova nodded, her gaze fixed on the world below. "It is. And it's worth every scar we took to protect it." The bridge was calm, the crew running through post-engagement checks with a quiet efficiency. The ship itself seemed to breathe around them, its systems settling into a steady, rhythmic hum. This confrontation would be recorded. It would be studied. Lord Executor Valerius would have to explain his failure to the hegemony. The doctrine that had been his source of power was now the source of his disgrace. He had been so certain of his strength that he never considered it could be used as a weapon against him. That was the flaw in all tyrants. They never looked in the mirror until someone held it up to their face. The public tally of his fleet's forced compliance would be a permanent mark on his record. The blockade lights of the Xylos fleet, now long gone, had dimmed into insignificance. What we do is not about punishing our enemies, but about reminding them of their own humanity even when they have forgotten it. We hold up a mirror, not a sword, because a reflection is a far more permanent and insightful wound. We offer a choice, a chance to turn back from the brink, for the ledger of history is long, and every soul must one day face its own accounting. A lesson given is a war averted. The orbital dance was a slow, graceful thing after the chaotic violence of the confrontation. Below Viridia was a swirl of continents and oceans, a vibrant world blissfully unaware of the fine edge upon which it had rested. On the bridge of the Indefatigable, the adrenaline had subsided, leaving behind the bone-deep weariness that always followed a battle not fought. Repair crews were reporting from the aft sections, their voices tinny over the comms, a litany of scorched conduits and buckled support struts. The cost of victory was being tallied in weld patches and medical supplies. Thorn oversaw the preliminary repair logs, his face etched with the strain of the last few hours. Plasma scoring runs deep on Deck 7, Admiral. We'll need a full yard overhaul to replace that armor plate. But the core is stable, and life support is green across the board. We were lucky. Rostova nodded, her eyes still on the planet below. Luck is the residue of design, Commander. Every system held because it was designed to. Every crew member performed because they were trained to. Her gaze was distant, seeing more than just the planet. She was watching the ghost of the Xylos fleet, their vector of retreat. Something was wrong with the picture. Archimedes, she said, her voice quiet, cutting through the low hum of the bridge. Run a deep spectrum analysis on the Xylos fleet's wake. Cross-reference their engine signatures with their stated velocity. There's a discrepancy I can't quite place. The AI's synthesized voice responded instantly. Already underway, Admiral. I noted the same anomaly. Their gravimetric output is inconsistent with a standard withdrawal burn. They are venting drive plasma at a rate that suggests inefficiency or damage. Rostova turned from the viewport, her brow furrowed. They didn't take enough damage to justify that kind of bleed. Not across the entire fleet. What aren't we seeing? A junior navigation officer looked up from his console. Ma'am, I think I have something. Long-range sensors are picking up another fleet high on the ecliptic plane. Their IFF tags are Xylos, but a different battle group. Heavier ships. They're burning hard, but not for us. He paused, tracing their projected course on the holotank. They're on an intercept course, with Valerius's fleet. A cold dread settled on the bridge. The implication was immediate and chilling. Valerius had failed. And in the Xylos hegemony, failure was not tolerated. His fleet wasn't retreating to safety. They were running for their lives from their own side. The doctrine of the ultimatum was absolute even for those who served it. There was no room for a failed Lord Executor to return home and explain his reasoning. There was only the sentence, swift and merciless. They're a purifier fleet, Thorn breathed, the color draining from his face. Sent to erase the failure. To wipe the ledger clean so the hegemony can pretend this never happened. Rostova's hands clenched into fists. This was the true hidden cost of the Xylos doctrine. It not only destroyed its enemies, it consumed its own. The mystery of the strange retreat was solved, and the payoff was a horrifying new moral dilemma. Valerius and his 97 ships were about to be annihilated by their own government. What's their strength? Rostova snapped. The tactical ensign's fingers flew across her screen. 12 capital ships, Admiral, but they're different. Showing as Executor class, heavy assault configuration. They significantly outgun Valerius's entire fleet, our own fleet. In our current state, we'd be at a severe disadvantage. The ship's internal lights flickered for a moment, as auxiliary power was rerouted, a stark reminder of their own wounds. A new countdown had begun. On Viridia, the celebrations were in full swing. A civilian vignette played out on a secondary monitor, a live feed from the capital city. A young girl, the same one from the transport ship, was being interviewed by a local news crew. She was holding her worn bear and talking excitedly about the mirror ships that had saved them. They didn't shoot, she said with the simple clarity of a child. They just showed the bad guys their own faces, and the bad guys got scared and ran away. Her mother stood beside her, tears of gratitude in her eyes. The stakes were no longer just about a strategic victory. They were about validating that little girl's faith. Rostova's jaw was tight. They had won. They had saved these people. Her orders were to secure Viridia and await further instructions. Engaging a second, more powerful Xylos fleet was not in her mandate. It was reckless. It was insane. Archimedes spoke its voice, a calm stream of logic in the turbulent sea of emotion. Admiral A, strategic withdrawal is the most logical course of action. Our primary mission is complete. Engaging the Executor fleet carries a 78.9% probability of catastrophic fleet-wide failure. The conflict triangle was sharp and piercing. Her moral line demanded she intervene. The AI's calculus demanded she retreat. The antagonist's doctrine in its most cannibalistic form demanded she simply watch. Open a channel to the unassailable will. Rostova commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that left no room for debate. Highest priority military band. I want to speak to Valerius, now. You do not abandon a man to a fire you helped set. The comms officer worked for a moment, his expression doubtful. Admiral, they may not answer. But then the channel opened. Valerius's face appeared on the screen, and he looked like a different man. His uniform was disheveled. The arrogant certainty was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunted look. Behind him, his bridge was in a state of controlled panic. Red lights flashed, and the sounds of distant alarms could be heard. Rostova, he said, his voice a ragged whisper. Come to gloat, to watch as the hegemony devours its own. Your lesson was well learned. So well, in fact, that I am now a liability to be erased from the historical record. His words were laced with a bitter, self-aware poison. He was a true believer whose God had just turned on him. I'm not here to gloat, Executor Rostova said, her tone even. I'm here to offer you a choice. The one thing your doctrine never allows for. She leaned forward, her eyes locking with his. I am offering you asylum. Power down your drives and accept the escort of my fleet. I will take you to Concordat space. You and every soul on your ships who wishes to live. The offer hung in the air, a concept so alien to the Xylos mindset that for a moment Valerius was speechless. Their system was built on orders, not on offers. He stared at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Was it suspicion, hope, or just the sheer dumbfounded shock of a man who had only ever known a hammer, seeing an open hand for the first time? Asylum. He finally choked out, a dark, humorless laugh escaping his lips. Your prisoner, you mean? A trophy to be paraded. No, Rostova countered, her voice firm. This fleet remembers by ledgers, never by collars. A refugee. A witness. Your testimony. Valerius could be the lever that breaks the back of the ultimatum doctrine from within. You can help us ensure no one Xylos or otherwise ever has to face a purifier fleet again. It was a gamble, a desperate appeal to a sliver of humanity, she wasn't even sure he possessed. Behind Valerius, an officer shouted, "Executor, the purifiers are hailing us. They demand our immediate surrender and preparation for summary fleet scuttling." The words were a death sentence delivered with bureaucratic coldness. Valerius closed his eyes for a long second. When he opened them, the hollow look was gone. In its place was a burning, defiant ember. He had been given a choice between certain death at the hands of his own people and a chance at a future, however uncertain, with his former enemy. He chose the dawn over the abyss. "What are your terms, Admiral?" He asked the word Admiral, now carrying a note of genuine respect, not sarcasm. "My terms are simple," Rostova replied. "You will transfer command authority of your fleet to me for the duration of this engagement. You will follow my orders without question, and you will broadcast a full, unedited log of your original orders, the Purifier Fleet's orders, and this conversation on an open system-wide channel. The entire sector is going to see the hegemony for what it truly is." This was the strategic flip the killbox turned inside out. She was not just saving a defeated foe. She was weaponizing the hegemony's own brutality against them on the galactic stage. The public ledger she had opened before would now be filled with the testimony of the hegemony's own Lord Executor. Valerius gave a single sharp nod. "Done." The screen went blank as he began the data transfer. Thorn stared at Rostova, his expression a mixture of terror and awe. "Admiral, what have you done? We're committing the entire fleet to save our enemy from their own allies, and our ship is barely holding together." The deck vibrated a low shudder from the strained inertial dampeners. A faint scent of ionized air, a byproduct of stressed energy conduits, wafted from a nearby vent. "I've upheld our ethos," Commander Rostova said, turning to face the holotank, which now showed Valerius's fleet as new green icons under her command. "We teach first, and we fight if forced." The first lesson was for Valerius. This one is for the hegemony. "Archimedes, what's the status of the mirror lattice and the gravity drones?" They did not abandon their principles when it was inconvenient. "The mirror lattice has sustained 62% node degradation." The AI reported its voice unchanged. However, 38% remains operational. The gravity projector drones are undamaged, but their power reserves are at 41%. A sustained engagement will deplete them entirely. It was a shoestring defense, a handful of mirrors and a half-powered net against a fleet of dedicated killers. "It will have to be enough," Rostova declared. "Signal the fleet. We are moving to intercept the Purifier fleet. Our objective is not to destroy them. It is to shield the Xylos defectors. We are placing ourselves between the hammer and the anvil." The command went out. Rostova's 20 ships, battered but resolute, moved as one. They surged forward away from the safety of Viridia and formed a thin blue line in the void. Behind them, Valerius's fleet held their position, their engines cold, their weapons silent. They were now improbably the civilians in this convoy crisis. The roles had been completely reversed. Valerius had issued an ultimatum and found himself at the mercy of his target. Now he was the one being protected by a doctrine he could never have conceived of. A debt of honor must be paid. The Purifier fleet, designated Hegemony First Fist, closed the distance with terrifying speed. They were sleek, menacing vessels, all sharp angles and weapon emplacements, devoid of any of the aesthetic flourishes of Valerius's command ships. They were pure function, and their function was to kill. Their lead ship, the Inevitable Judgment, broadcast on the open channel, Valerius was now flooding with his logs. The voice that spoke was synthesized, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the voice of the doctrine itself. "Concordat, Admiral Rostova. You are interfering in a hegemony internal matter. Your protection of the traitor Valerius is an act of war. Withdraw immediately, or you will be expunged. There was no negotiation, no countdown, just a statement of fact. "I am Admiral Rostova of the Concordat vessel Indefatigable," she replied, her voice ringing with calm defiance. "This is no longer an internal matter. It is a humanitarian crisis. The fleet of Lord Executor Valerius has formally requested and been granted asylum. Any attack on them is an attack on a protected convoy under Concordat law. We will not withdraw. We will hold this line. The line is the promise we make to the universe." The inevitable judgment did not bother with a reply. A volley of plasma torpedoes erupted from its forward tubes, streaking toward the Indefatigable. The Purifier's tactics were as brutal and direct as their philosophy. They targeted the flagship, aiming to decapitate the command structure in a single, overwhelming blow. "Incoming," Thorn yelled. "Deploying remaining mirror nodes. Activating gravity projectors, the remnants of the mirror." Lattice flared into existence, a ragged patchwork shield compared to its former glory. The gravity drones pulsed, creating a subtle but powerful distortion field in front of the human fleet. The plasma torpedoes, expecting a clear path, suddenly found their trajectories bent, their guidance systems fighting a losing battle against warped space-time. Several of the torpedoes went wide, careening harmlessly into the void. But the volley was too dense. A handful broke through the weakened defenses. "Impacts imminent," the tactical officer shouted. The Indefatigable shuddered as point defense lasers flared, intercepting two. A third slammed into the dorsal bow, shaking the ship to its very core. The lights didn't just flicker this time. They died. The darkness is always waiting. Emergency lighting kicked in a second later, casting the bridge in a hellish red glow. Sparks rained down from a ruptured ceiling conduit. The low thrum of the ship was gone, replaced by the high-pitched whine of emergency power and the blare of a hull breach alarm. The air grew thin, and the automated voice of the ship's computer began chanting a warning. Atmospheric pressure dropping on command deck. Emergency bulkheads deploying. "Damage report!" Rostova yelled, gripping her console as the deck tilted sickeningly. "Thorn, are you with me?" Commander Thorn was on the floor, shaking his head to clear it. A gash on his forehead was bleeding freely. "I'm here, Admiral Bridge. Integrity is failing. We've lost main power. We're running on fumes," Archimedes Rostova called out. "Are you still there?" The AI's voice for the first time sounded strained, distorted by the power failure. "Affirmative. Admiral. Main processing core is offline. I am operating from tertiary, redundant systems. Fleet command protocols are failing." They were blind, crippled, and adrift. From his position on the bridge of the unassailable will, Valerius watched in horror as the Indefatigable took the hit that was meant for him. He saw it list, saw the flicker of its drive lights, the sudden silence on the comms. He was witnessing a sacrifice he could not comprehend, made by an enemy who had every reason to let him die. And in that moment, the last vestiges of his old indoctrination burned away, replaced by a terrible, clarifying rage. A soul reforged in fire is the strongest of all. He stormed to his comms station, shoving his own officer aside. He opened a channel not to Rostova, but to the 96 other ships that had served under him. All Xylos ships of the 7th Armada, he roared, his voice filled with a fury that no purifier could match. "You have your orders. You saw what they did. The hegemony has declared us traitors. The Concordat has declared us people. We have a debt to pay. Power up your weapons. Target the purifiers. For our honor, for our lives, fire at will." It was an order that should have been impossible. An order to fire on their own kind. But they had seen their sentence in the plasma volley aimed at the Indefatigable. They had heard Valerius's broadcast. They had witnessed an act of courage that defied their entire worldview. And in that moment of truth, they chose their executor. They chose the dawn. Across the void, 97 Xylos warships, once the enforcers of the Ultimatum doctrine, roared back to life. Their weapon ports slid open, their engines flared, and they unleashed a torrential, desperate, glorious storm of fire upon the hegemony First Fist. The purifiers, so focused on their primary target, were caught completely by surprise. Their flank, which they had assumed was a static target of condemned ships, had just become a new, ferocious front. They had sown the wind, and now they reaped the whirlwind. The battle turned into a chaotic, swirling melee. The outnumbered and outgunned Xylos defectors threw themselves at the purifiers with a suicidal bravery. They were fighting for more than just survival now. They were fighting for redemption. On the crippled bridge of the Indefatigable, the emergency power began to stabilize. The red glow was replaced by a flickering, weak white light. Power is returning to primary systems. Archimedes crackled its voice, slowly regaining its clarity. The Xylos 7th Armada is engaging the Purifier fleet. My tactical analysis is unable to process this development within established Xylos behavioral parameters. Rostova pushed herself up her body, bruised but her will unbroken. She looked at the holotank, which was now a chaotic storm of red and green icons locked in a deadly embrace. It's because you're trying to analyze soldiers. Archimedes, she said, her voice quiet. Look again. They're not soldiers anymore. They're rebels. She looked at Thorn, who was getting his wound patched by a medical officer. Get me a firing solution. All remaining power to the forward particle lance. We are not out of this fight yet. A captain goes down with her ship, or not at all. The Indefatigable was a wounded beast, but it was not dead. With a groan of protesting metal, its main weapon came online. They had one shot, maybe two, before the system overloaded their failing power grid. The Purifier flagship, the Inevitable Judgment, was busy fending off an attack from 3 of Valerius's cruisers. Its shields were focused on its port side, leaving its starboard engine array momentarily exposed. There, Rostova said, pointing a trembling finger at the holotank. Target their primary drive. We're not aiming to kill. We're aiming to cripple. The targeting reticle locked on. The ship's frame hummed with a massive power buildup, a vibration that promised either salvation or dissolution. The lights dimmed again as every spare watt was diverted to the cannon. Fire, Rostova whispered. A brilliant blue-white lance of energy, the Indefatigable's last full measure of defiance, shot across the darkness. It struck the Inevitable Judgment's engine section with surgical precision. The Purifier flagship didn't explode. Instead, its drive went critical, erupting in a massive, silent flower of plasma and superheated gas. The ship went dark, its momentum carrying it forward, a dead hulk tumbling through the battlefield. Their judgment was postponed indefinitely. The loss of their flagship broke the back of the Purifier fleet. Their cold, calculated aggression faltered, replaced by confusion. They were taking heavy losses from Valerius's ships, who were fighting with the ferocity of the damned. The public broadcast of the entire engagement was being picked up by listening posts across the sector, a public relations nightmare for the hegemony. Within minutes, the remaining 11 Purifier ships disengaged, turning and burning for the nearest jump point, leaving their dead flagship behind. Silence fell across the battlefield. It was a ragged, wounded silence punctuated by the faint hiss of venting atmospheres from crippled ships on both sides. The space between the fleets was littered with debris, a graveyard of conviction. Valerius's voice came over the comm, heavy with exhaustion and something else: gratitude. Admiral Rostova, the enemy is in retreat. We have survived. We all have, Executor, Rostova replied, slumping into her command chair for the first time. The adrenaline was gone, leaving only a profound, aching exhaustion. Now comes the hard part. There were dozens of ships to repair, hundreds of wounded to tend to, and the monumental task of figuring out what came next for 97 warships and their crews, now a fleet without a nation. A pivot in history leaves scars on all who turn it. In the hours that followed, a strange new fleet took shape in the orbit of Viridia. The blue and white of the Concordat vessels mingled with the stark obsidian and gold of the former hegemony ships. Joint repair crews, communicating through translation software and universal hand gestures, worked to patch the hulls of both fleets. Medical teams shared supplies, treating the wounded without regard for the uniform they wore. It was a scene that would have been unimaginable just a day before. Valerius formally surrendered his fleet and himself to Admiral Rostova. The ceremony was quiet, conducted on the still damaged bridge of the Indefatigable. He handed over his command codes and his ceremonial sidearm, a symbol of his old life. "My people and I are in your debt, Admiral," he said, his voice stripped of all its former arrogance. "A debt we can never truly repay. We only ask that you judge us, not by the doctrine we were forced to serve, but by the choice we made when we were finally offered one." Rostova accepted the surrender not as a victor, but as a peer. "The Concordat will judge you fairly, Executor, and your testimony will be entered into the public record. What you did today, it may have cost you your home, but it may have saved your entire people from themselves. This was the true payoff, not a military victory, but the conversion of an enemy, the planting of a seed of dissent that could unravel the entire hegemony from within." Their ledger was now part of a larger accounting. The Concordat fleet, escorting its new unlikely allies, prepared for the long journey home. The Indefatigable, scarred but unbowed, took the lead. On the main screen, the public tally from the Aethel system was being archived. It showed the initial ultimatum, the human fleet's non-lethal response, the arrival of the Purifiers, and finally the status of the Xylos 7th Armada changing from hostile to allied asylum seekers. The institutional consequence was clear: an entire enemy fleet had defected, proving the ultimatum doctrine was a chain that would eventually strangle its own masters. The mirror arrays of the fleet, what was left of them, had cooled to a dull pewter gray. It is not the warrior's place to celebrate the end of a war, but to begin the work of building the peace that follows. That peace is not a gift. It is a task. It is built not on the ruins of the enemy, but from the salvaged pieces of shared understanding. We did not set out to conquer an empire. We set out to prove that even in the darkest void, the offer of a choice is a light powerful enough to make its own dawn. And so the work began.